Hello, and welcome to Praxis and Theodicy. In a previous video, we discussed usury, but we spent the entire time exploring a variety of definitions of usury, which begs the question, why is there such a variety of ways to define this one thing? The simple answer is that the way we define usury has changed over time. How we got from its original definition to the one we use today is what we will discuss in this video. One quick necessary note. This video will be focused on the history and evolution of the definition of usury in Christian culture, and, as a side effect, mostly Western civilization. One fascinating thing about usury is that it has been warned against in many major religions and cultures throughout history. If you missed it, we did put a video on that out, and it will be linked in the description below. We discussed the biblical teachings about practicing usury in our last video. Under the theocracy of Moses, the Israelites were called to carry economic practices of just, non-exploitative money lending. If someone needed money, or another form of tangible trade good, to survive, other citizens of enough means were expected to lend them what they needed. It was forbidden to expect anything more back from the lendee than what was originally loaned. In this way, the citizens of Israel maintained a society of egalitarianism that would be self-correcting if circumstances would unduly affect a certain citizen or family. Deuteronomy 15:11 sums it up nicely. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelite who is poor and needy in your land. Israel also had laws and traditions that would combat the human inclination to let wealth accumulate in smaller and smaller circles. Usury is certainly a powerful tool at accomplishing this goal, but the human need for greater power and wealth will always lead to attempts at hoarding it, and thus taking it out of generations of families and allowing it to pass into the hands of an elite minority. The Israelites had a written tradition that they would never get to celebrate. It was called the Year of Jubilee, and included in its celebration was an overwhelming redistribution of wealth and property back into the hands of all the people and families who originally had it. This would counteract the practice of wealth accumulation into a small minority and ensure that all the people of the nation prospered, not just a few. As we fast forward to the teachings of Jesus, it's worth taking a brief look into some of the laws and customs of the Roman Empire. Modern Western civilization has taken a great amount of inspiration from Roman law, so it's no coincidence that Roman law should appear familiar. During the fall of this empire, more and more citizens were enticed to borrow money from the more wealthy class, slowly transferring their own wealth away and turning much of the lower class into serfs. One interesting note about Roman restrictions on usury is that there were, on and off, rules about excess interest, or at least discussions of it, and some emperors outlawed compound interest, seeing it as a clearly exploitative practice. Aside from Roman law, usury itself was denounced as harmful by philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. We discussed Jesus' teachings on lending without expectation to receive anything in return. Many people are familiar with his call of self-sacrifice, including selling all you have and distributing your wealth to the poor. These teachings, along with the theological understandings of the never-seen Year of Jubilee, led the first followers of Christ to form intentional communities where private property would be eschewed in favor of common ownership. Property is perhaps the biggest thing that Western civilization borrows from Roman law, and the legal conception of private property is closely tied with the acceptance of usury, something we will explore in a future video. When the Church of Christ began to grow into a larger religion, more than just a strange movement called the Way, the councils of Nicaea were very significant in the formation of common Christian understanding and practices. The First Council of Nicaea, in the year 325, forbade Christian leaders from practicing usury, citing Ezekiel 18:8 and saying, "If after this decree any clergy be found to receive usury, whether he accomplished it by secret transaction or otherwise, as by demanding the whole and one half, or by using any other contrivance whatsoever for filthy lucre's sake, he shall be deposed by the clergy and his name stricken from the list. In the 9th century, at one of the heights of Christianity's alliance with the state, Emperor Charlemagne, as Emperor of Rome, expanded this Christian practice into the law of the land. This harshly authoritarian approach to usury prohibition would continue for several centuries. At the turn of the millennium, the taking of interest was still punishable by seizure of property. In the Church, the rule of excommunication was expanded to laymen. In 1311, Pope Clement V went so far as to declare secular legislation that was soft on usury to be of no consequence. Sometime around 1250, St. Thomas Aquinas writes a treatise on the theology of Christian doctrine, his most well-known work entitled Summa Theologica. In it, he writes extensively on usury, justifying what it constitutes and when taking interest would and would not be justified. He spends a great deal of time on it, enough that it is a terrific step towards defining what usury is and why it is harmful. In the year 1515, the Fifth Lateran Council puts a strong definition behind usury, more officially and more succinctly than Aquinas. For this is the real meaning of usury, when, from its use, a thing which produces nothing is applied to the acquiring of gain and profit without any work, any expense, or any risk. During the short reign of Queen Mary of England, usury was again outlawed. With her predecessor, Queen Elizabeth, the legislative practice changed. She instituted an interest cap of 10% in the year 1570, a cap that would remain in place for nearly 300 years. The 1600s to the 1800s saw the unchecked power of colonization take the reins of the story of Western civilization, with laws favoring regulation of interest instead of avoiding the practice altogether, and then with mercantilism and colonialism incentivizing investment and expansion. Even the common understanding of usury in the Christian Church began to fade, as it began to be understood as a matter of personal conscience, not something that was universally understood to be wrong or harmful. Mercantilism was dependent on investing into the expansion projects of colonialism. It is important to remember that, while this led to the success of empires, it also led to hardships for many of the people who lived in those empires. Even the settlement of America in the early 1600s was affected by usury at its root. A historical account of the early pilgrim settlers of Plymouth Plantation recalls, "Their greatest hardship was the compact with the merchants. The pilgrims were poor, and their funds were limited. They had no alternative, therefore, but to associate with others, and, as often happens in such cases, wealth took advantage of their impoverished condition." In the mid-1800s, mutualism was the economic theory pondered by anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. A radically libertarian but economically centrist ideology, it gives special recognition to the harm that openly practiced usury has on society. Mutualism and anarchism would strongly influence the theory of distributism and Christian anarchist labor movements 100 years later. By this time, with the full effects of the Industrial Revolution dictating the new way societies would be organized, mercantilism had by now given way to capitalism. With 2 world wars ahead, soon investment would become a game that everyone would want to join in on. But with at least 2 major financial crises also ahead, the Great Depression and the 2007 financial crisis, the world would feel the weight of putting usury at the heart of global interests. The understanding of lending at interest as a harmful act held tenaciously on to the formation of Western civilization. Cato the Wise of Rome, before the birth of Christ, responded to the question, "What do you think of lending at usury?" with his own question, "What do you think of murder?" Hundreds of years later, St. Ambrose would opine that where war is justified, usury is justified. In 1935, artist Eric Gill said, "I can think of nothing more appropriate for a symbol for the 20th century library than a version of Laocoon, that is, man, fighting with the twin snakes of war and usury. These are the powers of evil with which man in the 20th century will have to settle or perish. As much as there is no doubt that an acceptance of usury as an everyday part of our civilization has led to rapid growth and expansion, there is an equal lack of doubt that this imperialism is, at its core, destructive. Next time, we're going to talk about the close relationship between capitalism and all that the destructive forces of usury and war have brought to our modern world.